There are towns in America where the streets seem quiet, the people simple, and life ordinary. But behind the closed doors and whispered prayers, heaven and hell leave their marks. If you believe that stories like this matter, please take a second to like this video, subscribe so you won't miss the next tale, and share with someone who still believes in miracles, or at least wants to. The first time I heard about what happened to Daniel Miller, it was already too late for him to hide the truth. People in our little town of Ashgrove, tucked in the hills of Pennsylvania, still talk about that year, 2022, like it was a season of fire. Daniel wasn't a bad man. He owned a hardware store on Main Street, the kind of place that smelled of sawdust and oil. He'd been struggling for years, barely paying the bills, and some nights he told his wife he felt useless. But there was one evening in late January when, after another long day of silence in the store, he locked the front door, sat behind the counter, and prayed out loud. Folks say he prayed so hard the windows rattled. "Lord, if you hear me, lift me out of this pit. Show me your power." Strange thing is, right after that winter, customers started flooding in. Supply shortages that hit other towns somehow skipped Ashgrove. Contractors drove from 2 counties over to buy from Daniel. By summer, he was hiring workers, expanding, even sponsoring the Little League team. People said it was luck. But Daniel, in the beginning, swore it was God. He told everyone at church that he was nothing without prayer. But something began to shift that fall. Reporters came from Pittsburgh to cover his miracle store that never ran out of stock. Instead of thanking God, Daniel started calling himself a genius. His words changed. He joked that prayer was good for Sundays, but strategy was what really paid the bills. Folks noticed he stopped coming to the evening service. Then the whispers started. First, a delivery driver swore he saw Daniel standing alone outside the store at midnight talking to someone, except no one was there. Then his own nephew, a quiet boy, told his mother he saw black smoke curl out from Daniel's office window even when no fire burned. By November, Daniel's wife admitted she couldn't sleep beside him anymore. He would thrash in bed, shouting that voices were calling his name. One night, she said he woke up and his eyes looked as if they didn't belong to him. He kept repeating, "You promised me more. You promised me more." The town grew uneasy. Some remembered an old story. Back in the 1800s, a preacher in Ashgrove once warned that God blessed this land with plenty, but cursed it when pride took root. "You shall eat and never be full," the preacher had said, "unless you bow low." Few believed those words still mattered, until Daniel. It all came to a head the week before Christmas. Daniel announced he was planning to buy half the block, tear down the bakery, and even the small church next to his store, and build a modern shopping plaza. His own pastor begged him not to, but Daniel just laughed. He said God had nothing to do with his empire. That's when things turned terrifying. On the night of December 19th, the town was shaken awake. At 3 a.m., every dog began barking. People opened their windows and swore they saw Daniel's store glowing, not with fire, but with a pale, flickering light, like lightning trapped inside. The volunteer fire department rushed to the scene, but no flames burned. Instead, Daniel was standing in the middle of the street, barefoot, shaking, his face pale as chalk. He kept crying, "The hand! The hand was writing on the wall." Later, his workers swore they found deep scratches inside the store's back office, letters carved into the plaster. No one could read them clearly, but some said they looked like Hebrew. Daniel collapsed that night, his body rigid as if struck. For days, he wandered town like a man haunted, refusing to speak of what he saw. Finally, on Christmas Eve, he walked into the small church he had mocked. The whole congregation watched as he fell on his knees in front of the altar, sobbing so hard the pews shook. "Forgive me," he whispered again and again. After that night, Daniel changed. He sold part of his business to help rebuild the church roof. He went back to praying in the mornings, back to speaking softly instead of boasting. But the look in his eyes never left, the look of a man who had glimpsed something beyond. People in Ashgrove still tell his story like a warning. God will lift you up, but if you forget him, he will remind you, sometimes in ways you'll never forget. And that was just the first. What came next in Ashgrove made even Daniel's story feel like a shadow of something larger. It was the summer of 2023 when Ashgrove changed again. By then, folks were still whispering about Daniel Miller's terrifying encounter the year before, but life in small towns always moves forward. This time, the story centered around a young woman named Clara Hayes. Clara was only 23, but she had a voice that could stop a crowded diner cold. She grew up singing in the little church choir, raised by her grandmother after her parents passed in a car accident. Money was always scarce, and Clara worked double shifts waiting tables, but anyone who ever heard her sing swore she carried heaven in her lungs. In May, a traveling producer passing through town on his way to Philadelphia stopped at Rosie's Diner. He heard Clara humming as she poured coffee and asked her to sing a full verse. That night, he told her she had a gift meant for the world. "You don't belong in Ashgrove," he said. "You belong on the stage." Clara cried that night in her bedroom. She dropped to her knees, praying the way her grandmother had taught her, raw, desperate, without fancy words. "Lord, if you open this door, I'll never forget you. I'll sing your praises forever." The door opened fast. Within weeks, Clara was on a bus to New York City, then on a TV talent show. Everyone in Ashgrove gathered at Rosie's Diner to watch her first appearance. When she hit the high notes, people cheered so loud the windows rattled. She became the town's pride, the girl from nowhere suddenly shining everywhere. Through the summer, Clara rose like a comet. Radio stations played her voice. Her social media exploded. By August, she had a record deal and interviews in glossy magazines. At first, she kept her promise, thanking God publicly, singing gospel verses in her warm-ups, even flying home to sing at Sunday service. But fame has a way of reshaping the heart. By autumn, Clara's songs were different, slick, dark, and empty of the faith that first lifted her. She stopped visiting her grandmother. She laughed off her small-town roots in interviews, calling Ashgrove a stepping stone. And though people begged her to come back, she told them she had no time for small lives anymore. Then the shadows began to follow her. The first sign was during a concert in Chicago. Witnesses swore that when the stage lights hit her face, her eyes looked black, like ink spilling over white. She fainted in the middle of a song. Doctors called it exhaustion. Clara dismissed it. But back in Ashgrove, her grandmother said she started receiving phone calls at night. No one spoke, only Clara's voice, singing hymns the girl hadn't sung since she left town. Amazing Grace hummed through the receiver at midnight, though Clara was hundreds of miles away. By November, Clara's dreams turned violent. She woke screaming about choirs singing backwards, about burning churches, about hands pulling her down through the stage floor. She told friends she could hear whispers in every dressing room, voices repeating one thing: remember your vow. The breaking point came during a nationally televised awards show. Clara stood ready to accept a trophy glittering under bright lights, but just before she could speak, the microphone let out a screech. Every monitor in the arena flickered, and for 5 seconds her voice, recorded from years ago in the church choir, rang out instead of her prepared speech. The hymn was clear: "Great is thy faithfulness." The crowd thought it was a glitch, but Clara froze, staring at the ceiling as if some unseen hand was pressing her chest. She left the stage without finishing. The world saw it as an odd accident, but Ashgrove knew better, and Clara herself, she knew best of all. Clara returned to Ashgrove just before Christmas, not with a parade, not with cameras, but alone, in a black car that rolled through the snowy streets at dawn. Her grandmother opened the door and found her granddaughter trembling, pale, her once sparkling eyes sunken. "They won't leave me alone," Clara whispered. "Every night I hear them. Every night I see the fire." Her grandmother pulled her inside, lit a single candle, and told her the truth that old folks in Ashgrove always remembered. "This town is built on prayer, child. God lifts us when we bend our knees. But if we rise and turn our back, his voice will chase us down until we remember." For days, Clara hid inside that house. Reporters circled, trying to catch a glimpse, but she refused to appear. The only sound was her voice, trembling through the walls as she tried to sing the old hymns again. But sometimes she stopped mid-note, gasping, as if something heavy sat on her chest. Then came Christmas Eve service. The church was crowded, the air heavy with pine and candle wax. Just as the pastor began the final hymn, the doors opened. Clara stepped inside, her hair tangled, her face streaked with tears. She walked straight down the aisle, barefoot on the cold floor, and stood before the congregation. "I broke my vow," she said softly. "I traded the voice he gave me for applause that means nothing, but I can't run from him, not anymore." And then she sang. Not the polished pop songs, not the dark anthems that made her famous, but the same hymn she sang as a child. "Great is thy faithfulness." Her voice cracked at first, then grew stronger until the walls trembled. People swore they saw light, warm and golden, spilling across the altar as she sang. From that night forward, Clara withdrew from the glittering stages. She sang again, but not for fame. She recorded simple hymns and stories from Ashgrove, posting them online with no promotion. Strangely enough, those songs traveled further than her pop records ever had, reaching millions who said they felt peace in her voice. In town, people whispered that Clara had been spared, that God had pulled her back before pride consumed her. But Clara herself only ever said one thing: "When you make a vow to God, he never forgets, and neither should you." Her story spread like fire through Ashgrove. 2 years in a row, the town had seen blessings twist into warnings, and warnings turn into mercy. People began to wonder who would be next. It was the spring of 2024 when the story of Ashgrove turned darker still. By now, Daniel Miller's haunting vision and Clara Hayes' public collapse were local legend, but some people shrugged it all off as superstition. One of them was Mayor Robert Kane. Kane wasn't born in Ashgrove. He came from Harrisburg, a smooth-talking lawyer who moved to town in 2018, promising to revive the future. Folks voted for him because he spoke with confidence and wore crisp suits that made him look like success itself. For years, he pushed small projects, fixing roads, repainting storefronts. But in 2024, he had his eyes on something bigger. That January, Kane announced his plan to bring a massive tech distribution center to Ashgrove. It would mean jobs, money, growth. At least that's how he sold it. The deal was shaky, investors nervous. One night in February, Kane was seen slipping into the church alone long after midnight. The janitor swore he heard him whispering at the altar, "God, if you open this deal for me, I'll dedicate this town to you." 2 weeks later, everything fell into place. The investors signed. The governor shook his hand. Overnight, Kane became not just a mayor, but a regional celebrity, hailed as the man who saved Ashgrove. At first, he played the part. He gave interviews, smiling and saying, "This town's success belongs to God." He bowed his head in public prayers, but it didn't last. By summer, the money poured in and Kane changed. He began holding rallies where his name was chanted louder than any hymn. He ordered the church bells to ring during his speeches. He even mocked the old pastor once, saying, "Prayer doesn't fill the budget, leadership does." The town grew uneasy, remembering Daniel and Clara, but Kane laughed it off. "Those were personal tragedies," he said. "Don't mix them with politics." That July, something strange happened during the groundbreaking ceremony for the tech center. As Kane raised the golden shovel, the sky went dark. not cloudy but black, as if night had fallen in the middle of noon. People gasped. For 3 minutes, the sun was swallowed. Later, scientists said it was just an unpredicted solar anomaly. But in Ashgrove, the old folks whispered, the town is being warned again. The days after, Kane's behavior grew erratic. He started having sudden fits, freezing mid-sentence during meetings, as if listening to someone only he could hear. His secretary swore that in the empty town hall, she heard him arguing with invisible voices late at night. Then came the dreams. Kane told his closest aide he was seeing visions, the streets of Ashgrove split wide open, fire pouring out, children crying while faceless shadows cheered his name. "They keep asking me to sign something," he said. "A contract in red ink, but I never touch the pen." By September, people noticed his speeches turned darker. He promised endless wealth if people would trust him fully. He mocked those who prayed. And at one rally, when protesters held up signs that read, "Remember God," Kane shouted into the microphone, "I am the future of Ashgrove, not your God. Me." That's when the real terror began. On the night of October 12th, Ashgrove shook with a sound like thunder. Residents rushed outside thinking it was a storm, but the sky was clear. Instead, they saw the town hall glowing with a sickly red light. Inside, Kane was found alone in his office, collapsed on the floor. But it wasn't his body that shocked the first responders. It was the walls. All 4 walls were covered in fresh writing, scrawled in what looked like ash. The same phrase repeated again and again, "Return the town." Kane woke hours later, trembling, refusing to explain. For weeks he avoided public appearances, but whispers spread that his hands shook constantly, that he no longer slept, that he muttered prayers under his breath like a frightened child. On November 2nd, during a televised town meeting, the breaking point came. Kane began his speech strong, but halfway through, his voice faltered. He gripped the podium, his face pale, and then, with cameras rolling, he pointed to the back wall and screamed, "They're here, don't you see them?" The crowd saw nothing, but Kane collapsed, sobbing, begging, "Please don't take me. Please, I'll return it." After that, Kane disappeared from public life. He resigned quietly, citing health reasons. The tech center deal dissolved. The land returned to grass and silence. But here's what the townspeople never forgot. A week after his resignation, Kane walked barefoot into the little church at dawn. He fell on his knees at the altar and prayed so loudly the whole congregation, gathered for morning devotion, could hear him. "Lord, forgive my pride," he said. "This town belongs to you, not me. If you spare me, I'll never take what isn't mine again." And from that day forward, Robert Kane vanished from the spotlight. Some say he left Ashgrove entirely. Others say they've seen him in the back pews, head bowed, whispering prayers like a man who knows hell itself nearly claimed him. The people of Ashgrove told his story as the third warning. First a storekeeper, then a singer, then a mayor. Each lifted high, each struck low when they forgot the hand that raised them. By the end of 2024, folks were asking the same question in hushed tones. If God was warning Ashgrove year after year, what storm was he preparing them for? By the time 2025 rolled in, Ashgrove felt like a town living under a watchful eye. But still, life had to go on. Shops opened, kids played ball, and families gathered for Sunday potlucks. Yet everyone carried an unspoken question in their chest: who would be next? This year, it was a man named Eli Turner. Eli was 42, a local paramedic. Folks knew him as steady, reliable, the kind of man who showed up when you called 911 at 2 a.m. His life wasn't glamorous, but he was respected. Still, behind that uniform, Eli carried heavy grief. His wife had passed from cancer in 2020, leaving him to raise their daughter alone. He often sat in the dark kitchen at night, staring at her picture, whispering, "I can't do this, Lord. I need you." In March of 2025, Ashgrove was hit with a terrible accident. A bus full of factory workers overturned on Route 19. Eli was first on the scene. Witnesses swore he worked with supernatural speed that night, pulling men and women from twisted metal, stabilizing the wounded. Later, even doctors admitted they couldn't explain how so many survived. At the hospital, Eli slipped into the chapel, dropped to his knees and whispered, "God, if you carried me through this, I'll serve you with all I have left." Word of his heroism spread. News crews interviewed him. Donations poured into Ashgrove in his name. Suddenly, Eli wasn't just a paramedic. He was a local hero, a symbol of hope. At first, he deflected the praise, pointing to God. But soon, the cameras, the applause, the constant praise started to shift something in him. People began calling him the Angel of Ashgrove. The mayor of the next county offered him a seat on a health board. Eli started wearing expensive suits to meetings, speaking less like a medic and more like a politician. By summer, he was giving speeches where God's name never passed his lips. Instead, he said things like, "I saved this town," or, "When people needed a miracle, I gave it." The breaking point came in July, when the church invited him to speak at a revival service. Eli stood at the pulpit, looked at the crowd and said, "Faith didn't save those people on Route 19. Training did, discipline did, I did." The congregation sat in stunned silence. That night, the shadows came for him. Eli began having visions in August. At first, they came in sleep, the accident scene replaying. But this time, every person he pulled from the wreck stared at him with hollow eyes, whispering, "Not you, him." Then the visions followed him into daylight. Driving the ambulance, he'd glance in the rearview mirror and see bloodied faces in the back, silently pointing upward. Once, he swore he heard his late wife's voice in the radio static. "Eli, don't forget who carried you." By September, the torment grew unbearable. During a live interview on regional TV, Eli froze mid-sentence, eyes wide, staring into the camera. Later, viewers swore they saw a shadowy hand brush across the screen, though the station denied it. Eli bolted from the studio, trembling, muttering, "They're showing me the pit! They're showing me the pit!" He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. His daughter found him one night kneeling in the living room, rocking back and forth, whispering, "I didn't save them. I didn't save them." On October 31st, the night of Ashgrove's Fall Festival, the final warning came. Eli had agreed to light the bonfire in the town square. Hundreds gathered, music playing, children laughing. But when he struck the match, the flames roared up higher than anyone had ever seen. Witnesses gasped as the fire twisted into shapes, figures kneeling, hands lifted in prayer. And then, clear as a bell, a voice rang out from the flames, "Return the glory." The crowd fell silent. Eli dropped the torch, his face ashen, tears streaming down his cheeks. He fell to his knees right there in the dirt, sobbing so loudly the whole square heard him. "God, forgive me," he cried. "I stole what was yours. I am nothing without you." From that night forward, Eli vanished from the spotlight. He quit every board, every interview. He went back to his ambulance. Working quiet shifts no one noticed, but those who saw him at church said he never missed a service again. He sat in the front pew, head bowed, lips moving in constant prayer. The town whispered about the bonfire for months. Some said it was mass hysteria. Others swore it was a miracle, but everyone agreed on one thing. Eli Turner had been lifted high and then broken low until he remembered who held the true power. By the end of 2025, 4 stories had unfolded in Ashgrove. 4 warnings, 4 mercies. And people began to murmur, "This isn't coincidence. This is a pattern." By 2025, Ashgrove had already lived through 4 straight years of miracles and warnings. People said the town was under a strange kind of spotlight, one you couldn't see, but you could feel. Every year, someone rose up, forgot the one who lifted them, and then fell hard. And in our time, the one who carried that burden was Sarah Whitfield. Sarah wasn't a preacher, a politician, or a singer. She was a journalist. She grew up here, left for school, and came back only last year to work for the Ashgrove Herald, the paper barely anyone read anymore. On the side, she ran a podcast. At first, it was just small stories, local history, old legends. But when she started covering what happened to Daniel Miller, Clara Hayes, Robert Kane, and Eli Turner, everything changed. Listeners tuned in by the thousands, then tens of thousands. By spring, Sarah's podcast wasn't just local gossip, it was national news. She became the voice of Ashgrove, the one telling the world about the town that God wouldn't leave alone. At first, she was humble. She said she was just collecting testimonies, preserving memories. But fame has a way of rewriting the heart. Soon, she began twisting the stories, adding darker music, exaggerating details, making the warnings sound like horror tales instead of cries for mercy. She called Ashgrove the cursed town and herself its official storyteller. Sponsors started paying her, advertisers lined up. And with every episode, her words grew bolder. These aren't acts of God. She laughed once on air. These are just perfect stories for people who crave a little fear. That was when the first strange thing happened. One night in June, while editing an episode about Clara Hayes, Sarah played back her raw recording. At first, it was just her voice. Then, faintly beneath it, came another. A whisper, low and heavy, speaking words she had never recorded. "Do not profit from my warnings." Sarah froze. Her hands shook. She deleted the file and told herself it was nothing but corrupted audio. But after that, it happened again and again. Each time she recorded, faint sounds crept in. Children singing hymns, the scrape of chalk on a blackboard, the soft echo of prayers. Instead of slowing down, she grew defiant. "If this town's God wants to haunt me," she joked to a friend, "then fine, ghosts make great content." But by July, the jokes ended. She was live streaming an episode about Eli Turner's bonfire when the lights in her office began to flicker. At first, she laughed, playing it up for her viewers. Then the chat exploded, people typing frantically, "There's someone behind you." Sarah turned the camera, showing an empty corner. Nothing there. She smirked, brushed it off, and ended the stream. But when she reviewed the footage later that night, her blood ran cold. For just a split second, before the lights steadied, a figure was there, a man in torn clothes, face hidden in shadow, pointing straight at her. From that night on, Sarah stopped mocking, but the shadows had already chosen her. After that live stream, Sarah couldn't sleep. She left her equipment off for days, but the silence in her apartment felt worse than the whispers in her audio. Every night, she swore she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Once, just before dawn, she opened her laptop and found a new file she hadn't created. It was audio. She pressed play and nearly screamed. It was her own voice, reading from the book of Jeremiah. "You have spoken falsely in my name, I have not sent you." Sarah slammed the laptop shut. She didn't own a Bible. She hadn't read those words in years. The more she tried to ignore it, the heavier it pressed on her. During a recording session in August, her microphones refused to work. Batteries drained within minutes. And then, in the dead air, a hymn began. Children's voices, clear and sweet. "Jesus loves me, this I know." Her viewers heard it live. Comments flooded in. "What is happening? Stop. This isn't right. This isn't just a story." By September, Sarah was unraveling. She confessed to her sister that every mirror in her apartment showed things that weren't there, shadows behind her, faces that didn't belong to her own. She walked through town, pale and sleepless, muttering to herself. One night, she stumbled into Rosie's diner, the same place where Clara Hayes once sang. People said she sat in a booth alone, staring at her hands. Then she whispered out loud, I've made his warnings into my business. I've made his mercy into entertainment, and now it's coming for me. But the breaking point came in October. Sarah decided to host a live event in Ashgrove's community hall, inviting listeners to hear the true cursed stories of the town. The hall filled with locals and strangers alike. She began her speech boldly, reciting Daniel's visions, Clara's collapse, Cain's madness. But as she reached Eli's story, the lights cut out. Total darkness. And then it came. A voice, not hers, not anyone's from the crowd. Deep, echoing, undeniable. These are not stories. These are warnings. Return them to me. The audience screamed. Phones captured only static. Some swore they saw fire moving across the walls like handwriting. Others swore they heard weeping. Sarah dropped her microphone, fell to her knees, and sobbed into the silence. Lord, forgive me. I twisted your works into my profit. I mocked what was holy. Don't let me be the next curse. When the lights returned, she was still on the floor, trembling. The crowd left shaken, but no one doubted what they'd seen. After that night, Sarah shut down her podcast. She deleted every recording, every file, every ad deal. In its place, she began posting simple, quiet prayers, readings of psalms, testimonies of faith. No music, no theatrics. Just her voice, trembling but sincere. Strangely enough, those videos reached more people than her podcast ever had. Today, when you see her in town, she looks humbled, almost fragile, but her eyes are clear. And if you ask her what happened, she'll only say, "Don't ever use God's miracles for your own crown. They're not yours to sell. They're His to share." In Ashgrove, people whispered that the fifth warning had touched the storytellers themselves, that God was guarding not just the town, but even the way its stories were told. And it left everyone asking, if He had warned 5 years in a row, what would the final year bring? By late 2025, Ashgrove was no longer just a dot on the Pennsylvania map. It had become a place people whispered about across the country, a name carried on podcasts, news outlets, and even sermons in distant churches. 5 years in a row, someone in this little town had risen, fallen, and been confronted by something greater than themselves. And by the 6th year, the entire town felt as though it was living inside a prophecy. The person at the center of the final story wasn't a shopkeeper, a singer, a mayor, a medic, or even a journalist. It was the town itself. The first sign came in November. For weeks, people reported strange weather that never showed up on forecasts. A sky clear and blue would suddenly dim as though dusk had fallen, then brighten again moments later. Farmers said their cattle grew restless, mooing at nothing, staring at empty fields. Children spoke of hearing church bells at night, though the church itself stood silent. Ashgrove had grown used to individual warnings, but now it felt like the land itself was trembling. Then came the night of November 21st. It was a Sunday, and nearly the entire town had gathered for evening service. Pastor Henry, an old man with shaky hands, stood at the pulpit, his voice breaking as he read from the Psalms. And just as the final hymn began, the ground shook. At first, people thought it was an earthquake. Dust fell from the rafters, pews rattled. But then the windows glowed, not from fire, not from lightning, but from a light so white it was almost unbearable to see. Some swore it felt like standing under the gaze of an unseen eye. The hymn faltered. People wept, covering their faces. And in that silence, something strange happened. Every bell in town, church bells, school bells, even the old cracked one that hadn't rung in decades, began to toll at once. No one touched them. No one could have. The sound rolled over Ashgrove like thunder, like judgment. Children cried out. Old men dropped to their knees. And then, in that trembling, a voice rose, not from any throat, but from everywhere at once. Some said it shook the walls. Others swore it spoke directly in their hearts. It said only one thing, "Ashgrove, remember me." The bells stopped. The light faded. The quake stilled. But nothing in the town would ever feel ordinary again. That night, hundreds of people stayed in the church until morning, praying like they hadn't in years. Strangers reconciled, enemies forgave each other, and families held hands. No one wanted to leave, afraid the moment would pass. It wasn't just one person's warning anymore, it was the whole town's. And as dawn broke, the people of Ashgrove realized this wasn't just about them. It was about everyone who heard their story. The next morning, Ashgrove felt different. People stepped outside and noticed things they hadn't seen before. The sunlight on the rooftops, the way the wind carried the smell of pine, the quiet hum of life that seemed holy. It was as if the town itself had been baptized in mercy overnight. Sarah Whitfield, Daniel Miller, Clara Hayes, Robert Kane, Eli Turner, and Margaret Cole, all of them stood together in the small church. They were no longer the people who had chased fame, power, or pride. They were humbled, marked by their experiences, united by the lessons of these past 5 years. Daniel touched the altar and whispered, "I will never forget who lifted me." Clara sang softly, the voice of a child who had remembered God's mercy. Cain knelt in silence, shaking but finally at peace. Eli rested his hands on the pew, feeling weight lifted from his chest. Margaret smiled at her students who had come to witness the moment, now teaching not just knowledge, but wisdom. And Sarah, once eager to broadcast fear, only spoke gently, "We tell the stories to remember, not to exploit." Outside, townspeople whispered of miracles they had seen, lights in windows when no electricity was on, shadows moving with intention, songs in empty streets. Every family had their own story of how the town had been warned and spared, and every single person who had risen in pride now knelt in repentance. It was a reminder that blessings could be lost when forgotten, but mercy was never beyond reach. That even when people turned away, God's warnings came, not to punish forever, but to bring them back. By the end of the day, the town of Ashgrove felt united in a way it never had before. People talked quietly about the past 5 years, about miracles, visions, and warnings. They understood that their lives, their stories, and even the ordinary streets of Ashgrove carried divine weight. And as the sun set over the town, bathing it in golden light, Pastor Henry spoke to the congregation one last time that evening. "Remember, we were all given chances. Ashgrove was spared, not for our pride, but for our repentance. May we always carry this lesson forward. If you've listened to all 6 stories, you've traveled the streets, the fears, and the blessings of Ashgrove with us. Every rise, every fall, every prayer and warning, it all reminds us that no matter how ordinary a place may seem, God's hand is never far, and mercy waits for every soul willing to return." Thank you for listening. If these stories moved you, remember to like this video and subscribe. Share them with someone who believes in miracles, or someone who needs to be reminded that even in the darkest moments, redemption is possible. Ashgrove's story doesn't end here. Its lessons and its warnings live on in all who hear them.